Good evening. I'm Joanne Heiler, founding director of the Broad. Thank you for joining us virtually for the Broad's latest program in the Unprivate Collection series with Catherine Opie and Christopher Hawthorne, moderated by Carolina Miranda. Today's conversation will explore Kathy Opie's art practice, which involves representing often what is overlooked, whether it's contemporary built landscapes or entire communities, and the resonance between her work and that of the City of Los Angeles's Civic Memory Working Group. Christopher Hawthorne oversees this initiative, which was established to rethink how Los Angeles commemorates its history. As a columnist and writer for the LA Times, Carolina Miranda has been reporting on this cultural shift in how we memorialize our past with honesty, equity, and complexity in light of the social and racial reckoning of recent years. Opie's Monumental, a recent acquisition to the Broad collection, is featured in our current exhibition, Since Unveiling, Selected Acquisitions of a Decade. Occupying a vast wall in our first floor galleries, the 7 large-scale pigment print photographs were taken during a road trip from Los Angeles to Richmond, Virginia, where Black Lives Matter demonstrators had reclaimed a Confederate statue of Robert E. Lee as a site of protest for racial justice. This image is flanked by iconic photographs of American wilderness, deliberately blurred to place distance and reflection into each scene. In September 2021, the statue of Robert E. Lee was removed, and Opie has said about this piece, "There is a suspended sun that never quite sets on the history of racism in this country." It is very much what I was thinking about as I was traveling and ultimately making this piece. Catherine Opie is an LA-based artist working primarily in photography. In September 2008, the Guggenheim Museum in New York presented her mid-career exhibition, Catherine Opie, American Photographer. She was a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow recipient and the Robert Mapplethorpe Resident in Photography at the American Academy in Rome for 2021, last year. Her first monograph, Catherine Opie, was published last year by Phaidon. Opie received a BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and an MFA from the California Institute of the Arts in 1988. A longtime teacher of studio art, she holds the Linda and Stuart Resnick Endowed Chair in Art at UCLA, where she is also chair of the Department of Art. Christopher Hawthorne is the Chief Design Officer for the City of LA. In this role, he develops new initiatives and provides design oversight related to architecture, planning, urban design, and public art across the city. Prior to joining City Hall, he was the architecture critic for the LA Times from 2004 to 2018. Christopher's writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Yorker, Architectural Record, Harvard Design Magazine, and many other publications. He is professor of the practice with an appointment in the Department of English at the University of Southern California's College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, where he directs the Third Los Angeles Project, a series of public conversations about architecture, urban planning, mobility, and demographic change in Southern California. Carolina Miranda is arts and urban design columnist for the Los Angeles Times, where she covers art and architecture. She also served as founding co-chair of the Los Angeles Times Guild, the Times employee union. Prior to the LA Times, she was an independent journalist contributing to Time Magazine, Art News, Fast Company, Architect, Art in America, and National Public Radio. She's a regular commentator for KCRW's Press Play and the New York Review of Books. Carolina is winner of the 2017 Rabkin Prize in Visual Arts Journalism. Our at-home audience, all of you, can submit questions for the panelists through this chat feature on YouTube, and we invite you to do so. This talk is virtual, obviously, but the Broad Museum is open to visit in person. And I hope you'll be able to experience Kathy's artwork in our collection exhibition, Since Unveiling, Selected Acquisitions of a Decade. It's on view through April 3rd. So without further ado or introduction, I'll turn the program over to Catherine Opie, Christopher Hawthorne, and Carolina Miranda.
Hello, hello.
Hello. So this was supposed to be the Broad's first in real life events, and I just wanted to thank Joanne and Ed Pituto and Darren Klein at the Broad for just turning on a dime in the age of Omicron and making this a virtual event. So thanks to everyone at the museum, and thank you all for bearing with us. I really appreciate it. We are here on the occasion of the Broad's acquisition of Catherine Opie's Monumental, which is one of a new series of work, a suite of 7 photographs that are in the first floor of the Broad. And their scale is surprising, so do not let what you see on this talk make you think that you know the work by seeing it. You really have to see it in person. So I would recommend getting down here to marinate in it a little bit. So I wanted to start with Monument. You hit the road in an RV in 2020, mid-pandemic, in the wake of the uprisings.
Middle of August.
The middle of August, in the wake of the uprisings, LA to Richmond. And so, I just want to know a little bit about what inspired that journey, and why Richmond. How did Richmond end up being your destination?
Well, it was Richmond, but all through the South, actually, because the whole body of work is titled 2020. This piece is monumental, and it's a stand-in kind of, it was the first piece I made out of the body of work, which is more of a poem for me. It's a visual poem of the moment of 2020. But a couple of reasons. My son got into Tulane University. They were going to be in person. My wife and I were going to drive in a station wagon and stay in hotels across the way. And the whole time that I had been, all of us being locked down in the pandemic, I was highly aware of journalism and news media and social media. And when the first kind of photograph of the Robert E. Lee came up on my feed, I think from the Washington Post photograph possibly, was one of the first things I had seen it in, I was just like, oh, I actually need to go again out into the landscape and bear witness of this moment. It was again before the election. It kind of followed with bodies of work like 1999, In and Around Home, Inauguration. It had its own lineage of what an American road trip meant. And so I kind of announced to Julie that I was buying an RV. And instead of driving the station wagon, we were going to go across country in the RV. And how about having a journey with me for about a month? And we did. We traveled for a month after we dropped Oliver off at Tulane.
Wow. And this for you was also bearing witness, but also a way to make work.
Well, yeah,
pandemic,
absolutely.
Right?
No, it was a safe way. I wasn't going to be able to get on a plane. I need to carry a lot of cameras with me, and I wanted food and shelter and everything to be enclosed.
This actually, I had wanted to ask you a little bit more specifically about the work, and a question from a viewer came in, which I think is perfect to drop in here. They ask, in Monumental, we see the monument of Robert E. Lee centered and sandwiched between scenes of the American landscape. Where were these other photos taken, and how did you decide which landscapes to show from your 6-week road trip? And I don't know if it's visible online, but if we could get slide number 1 on view, that'd be great.
Well, the landscapes are all throughout America, both the South and the West. And because after I came back from Richmond, we, kind of went through the South and back up and around. I dropped Julie off and I went on to Oregon because I wanted to look at Portland, Oregon. I became really fascinated with these sites of civic unrest in terms of how they were treating the downtown buildings. And that became really fascinating to me. And so that was a lot of, because one of the things that you understand is like, okay, you see the journalistic photograph of the Brianna Taylor Memorial, but what you don't understand is that the federal courthouse across from it is all boarded up. So I needed to also physically see these sites, not necessarily photograph the protests, but see the sites. So with this piece, being a poem, I wanted it to be quieter. I wanted it to be more ethereal. I always look at the landscape as a pause. And also the questions of whose land is this is always present in terms of an American identity. And so the abstract nature of them being out of focus is also allows you to have a different relationship of wondering about them. You don't automatically identify it as sight. Instead, it becomes a cognitive relationship to how you build an image. But the first photograph and the end photograph are the most important pieces of the poem. And it's kind of what Joanne said about, the sun never setting. You'll notice that the sun is actually in the exact same location. You think it's setting, but I simply moved the camera. And so that relationship of the hovering sun and the notion that that racism could be actually abolished within this country, and even though I have the optimism of eventually that happening, I also have the reality of this constant fight over this land.
Yeah. It struck me really to think about when I saw the piece downstairs of what landscape produces the monument at its heart. And so anyway, I'm excited to spend a little bit more time down there checking it out. Before we go down the rabbit hole of Kathy's work, I'm just going to lob a softball question at Christopher here. Christopher, you worked on the Civic Memory Working Group, which produced that really important report, Past Due, about how we construct monuments, how we take them down. It's downloadable at civicmemory.la, and it's actually really good reading. So,
thank you for saying so.
I highly recommend it. I want to start with a very basic question, which is taking a step back and wanting to get a sense, about the purpose that monuments serve in a city's landscape, because I feel like one of the frequent critiques when they are removed is this idea of the erasure of history, that, we're erasing history by taking down that Confederate monument. Mm-hmm. What purpose do they serve, and how, what purpose does removal play?
Well, it is such a frequent sort of complaint when these changes are made. And first, let me just echo your thanks to the Broad for having us, and Joanne and Ed and Darren. It's really fantastic to be in conversation with two people whose work I admire so much, and to have the chance to connect the work that we were doing with this work that Kathy's been making during the very time that we were convening these meetings of the Civic Memory Working Group and thinking about the very same issues of whose land this is. And I think, the purpose of, we tend to think of monuments as enshrining a certain moment in fixed form, helping us make sense of some historical figure or monument, but really always what monuments do in addition to that, and sometimes really predominantly what they do, is tell the story of the people who are putting them up. They reflect the culture that produces them rather than the historical moment that they sort of purport to fix. Eternally, that's so true of the Confederate monuments, so many of which were produced in the early 20th century rather than on the heels of the Civil War, and they were in response to really calls for more self-determination and really, what we now call equity in terms of thinking about participation in American politics and in civic life. So I think they very much represent that present rather than this sort of fixed past. And I think we have to begin, when we grapple with the question of what to do with them, we have to begin with that question, really what were the circumstances of their production rather than the historical moment and whether they tell that story accurately or not. And that was really one of the driving forces behind the idea of convening the Civic Memory Group. In the first place, it was 2019 when we decided to bring the group together for the first time, and already there had been a national conversation about Confederate monuments and memorials and other controversial and complicated and fraught civic monuments. And I think we thought that we needed a Los Angeles version of that conversation that was really grounded in our own particular and I would say peculiar relationship to history here. Because despite the way we pat ourselves on the back sometimes and thinking, this isn't a state that's awash in Confederate monuments, we have been guilty of more aggressive erasure of various, successive histories and pasts and communities than is true for probably any other big American city. This is a city that not only has been so in love with its own reputation as a city of the future, always looking ahead, but also has been founded, particularly its sort of modern civic identity, which was really about establishing a kind of specifically Anglo elite here in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That was based on myth-making boosterism that was much more aggressive and in some ways much more sort of unapologetic in the kind of erasure that it produced than even cities in the American South, even than Washington, D.C. So there were a lot of big questions that I felt and we felt as the members of this group that we had to answer before we started being more prescriptive the way other cities had been. We studied very carefully work that cities like New York and other cities had done that did produce more prescriptive lists of these are the monuments that should come down or go up, or here are the New Yorkers.
Those also produced a lot of fights.
Exactly, and we thought there were bigger questions that we needed to begin to grapple with. So rather than a sort of, set of rules, we wanted this to be a kind of guidebook that listed the questions and themes that cities, institutions, cultural organizations should be thinking about. And then this last thing I'll say about the genesis is really that, we think of this conversation having changed really relatively quickly. But there are community activists, there are organizers, there are artists who have been doing this work for many, many decades. And when a statue comes down, we have a conversation in the report with the leaders of Monument Lab, which is the great Philadelphia-based organization that really, in a national level, is doing a lot of the most important work along these lines, and was the first grantee of the New Mellon Foundation Monuments Fund. And Paul Farber, one of the founders of Monument Lab, said in that conversation, when a monument is taken down, the news sometimes treats it as something that happened really suddenly, but it's always the result of many years, if not many decades, of activism, of organizing. And so we also started with the idea that we wanted to learn from and build on that work that had been happening outside of City Hall for a long time and see what lessons might apply to the work that we wanted to do from City Hall and within City Hall.
Yeah, that was a critique. I'd love to get slide number 23 up. This is Lee Circle in New Orleans, and there had been, there have been those very critiques that when this monument came down in 2017, that Mitch Landrieu gave a very important speech about it. It was printed in whole in the New York Times. Left out of the equation were the many activists who had been working on the removal of that monument for years, among them the jazz musician Wynton Marsalis, who had been petitioning for the removal of this monument. And I actually saw this photo is from last month. I happened to be in New Orleans, and it is remarkable to see that circle stripped of all reference to Lee, and still to see that marble plinth. Taking it back to Kathy, can we get image number 3 up, please? I think you've done so much of your work is grounded in the political body, politics, protest. In fact, I ran into you at a protest once.
The Women's March.
The Women's March, taking pictures. I was covering it, and you were there taking pictures. And you've also did a book on the inauguration of President Obama. And the last time we talked actually was for another poetic series of works, which was the Rhetorical Landscapes.
Oh, yes.
Series at Regan Projects about swamps, and you traveled to literal swamps to understand our idea of the metaphor of swamps. So I'd love to get a sense of how you see the current series fitting into that body of work, because you do have these series that are somewhat more literal and narrative in nature, and then these others that are quite poetic and much more abstracted. And how do you see those coming together?
Well, I've always said that I'm not a singular identity as an artist, but I think that the bodies of work for me form because of either particular moments of what I really feel photography can do. And I started out photographing because Lewis Hine and child labor laws, and so and that was me deciding that at 9 years old. And I think that I grew up in a very political family. My father actually owned the largest political campaign collection in the country. That's all in the Smithsonian now. Oh, wow. So I grew up with all the original Lincoln stereotypes and things like that he had started collecting when he was a boy in Ohio. And so politics was always very much a part of our life, and I grew up in a Midwestern Republican family but my politics obviously shifted from that place, and eventually my father's did as well. But the notion of bearing witness and what it is to go around and collect images, especially of the moment that we live in, are exactly the impetus of what photography gave to me as a kid. Like, growing up, like being born in 1961, we got to grow up with Look and Life magazine and National Geographic and all these kinds of different representations that were fraught as well. But it allowed you to understand what it meant to trace history. And so when I'm working in that vein, I'm really just tracking history and trying to answer my own questions. And the image that is up right now was why I decided to do the road trip. Is I went to the march, to the protest on Beverly, and I literally watched how both LAPD and the sheriff department basically constructed the perfect storm for it to become to civil unrest. The police cars were emptied and left in the middle of it. They surrounded all of us. They started shooting tear gas and rubber bullets on us. The police cars ended up getting burnt. And then, soon after that, the city started to burn. And so I'm always like, it's like this photograph in itself is right before it became violent. And then with the body of work 2020, they're all diptychs, because I don't necessarily know that this time can be a single photograph. I do believe that this time is about discourse and dialogue. So each thing is placed within a diptych to kind of create that sense of discourse and dialogue that we actually need in communities and as human beings right now. And so below it is just a simple beginning to trace the monuments I'm going to photograph throughout the road trip.
I'd love if we could get up number 4, because you were talking about
so this is Brianna Taylor's memorial in Louisville, Kentucky, and with this family, I spent a good portion of the day at the Richmond Monument because I actually wanted to kind of really document every trace of it, So I really did, a lot of images there. And as I was working with bigger cameras, families would come up and ask if I would do their family portrait. With their phones, and they would hand me their phones, and then it's the COVID.
Those folks have some very lucky family portraits.
I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'm going to touch their phone. I don't know. I mean, I have like spray in my pocket. It was like in a moment of like, okay, should I really be, handling other people's phones? But this family was so amazing. They sat right in front of George Floyd's sign on the memorial that's below. And I asked if I could take my own picture of them, and they said, of course. I didn't get their names, so that's why it's just a family portrait, because I didn't have a notebook or anything. And but it was really wonderful.
Incredible. The graffiti on it is just on fire.
The graffiti was incredible to watch it, and if you go through old images in terms of social media, to watch the graffiti culminate over that period of time was really amazing.
Wow. I wanted to switch gears a little bit because I feel like your work delves in its scale and sometimes in the topics it deals with engages the monumental. And in these cases, literal monuments. But if we could get image number 16 up, and wanted to shift to Christopher, because you have said that apparently part of what inspired some of your research for the report were some of Kathy's freeway photos and strip mall photos. So I want to know a little bit about how that came to be and how did they shape your view of things?
Well, there's such fantastic pieces, and I think anytime you begin a conversation in Los Angeles about monuments, you have to think about the freeway in all kinds of complicated ways, right? The scale of them, the way in which they became so closely identified with LA's civic identity, and then also the ways that they were monuments to, I would say, white prerogative, to the prerogative of bureaucracy, of infrastructure, of engineering expertise, at the expense often of communities, culturally, but also literally in terms of erasing or bisecting or scattering, displacing communities all over Los Angeles, and that is true in analyzing the role of a freeway in any American city, but given the big bet we made on freeways and the major way that we remade the kind of civic landscape around them, there were, again, more of those pockets of displacement of communities bisected in Los Angeles than elsewhere. And, you know, the received wisdom in the kind of architectural history of Los Angeles, writers like Rayner Banham or Joan Didion, you know, they talked about freeways as a unifying force. As I think the Joan Didion line is that they're the only secular communion that Los Angeles has is the freeway. Rayner Banham talked about them as works of art. There's a great book by David Broadsley, who published a book on the LA freeway in the early 1980s. And he describes the freeway as the kind of synecdoche, the only, as he puts it, the one part of Los Angeles that's capable of standing in for the whole. So that sort of Didion Banham LA freeway idea in the architectural world has been, I think, very, you know, productively challenged and complicated by a lot of more recent work by scholars like Eric Avila, who was a member of our working group, and others, and artists like Ruben Ochoa. I don't know if we can bring up the last slide. I don't have the numbers in front of me.
I'll look for the number.
Okay, thank you. And who have begun to challenge that. And I think the freeway came up over and over again in the conversations that we had as part of the Civic Memory Working Group as something that the city needed to grapple with and really begin to talk about dismantling. And, you know, I wrote a series of pieces when I was at the Times about the need to begin to take some major parts of the freeway out of commission, and I will say that didn't get the best reception from some of our editors because it just seemed so, you know, the immediate practical questions arose like, what will happen to traffic, you know? And in particular, I was looking at the stub of the two freeways that comes down from the 5 and sort of reimagining that as a kind of public space that could be emptied of cars, but then retain its sort of monumental qualities. And now it's really fantastic to see at the federal level, Pete Buttigieg and the Biden administration talking about, on a national level, the need for cities and city governments and regional governments and the federal government to grapple with the really destructive role that freeways have played in so many communities and begin to think about reimagining them. And, you know, for us in Los Angeles, rethinking what the monument means necessarily, I think, means with starting with the freeway. And so, of course, as we were talking about it, these, you know, these images, which really capture all of those elements of what the freeway has meant in Los Angeles, were, I think, very much in our minds.
So the photo of Ruben Ochoa is number 38. And I've written about Ruben before, and I am so intrigued by this work. I don't know if you want to explain what it is.
So it's a kind of trompe-l'oeil. So he, and just practically, it was a really tricky project. So he had to get permission from Caltrans to close off a little shoulder freeway and then find a crew that could help him essentially put wallpaper on these slabs of freeway. This always makes me think of the Berlin Wall also. There's a kind of not only a window into what's behind and what was destroyed and sort of reconnection, but also this idea of dismantling and what it means to begin to take down these really monumental slabs and the sort of liberating forces that might be unleashed, even by imagining that in Los Angeles. I mean, I think when you were talking about the protests, still the most powerful protest in Los Angeles is when people go on the freeway. And
when they shut down the freeway.
It's amazing always to hear the traffic reporters in the helicopters because their minds are just about to explode because the idea of pedestrians on the freeway for whatever cause is so counterintuitive to people whose job is, you know, really to think about traffic and the, you know, free movement of traffic on the freeways. And so this idea of beginning to challenge, dismantle, reimagine is so, I think, beautifully evoked by this piece of Ruben Ochoa's.
He said it was slightly, because it's a wallpaper that makes it seem as if you're looking behind to this bucolic landscape behind the wall. He said it was pretty terrifying to work on the freeway.
Yeah, no, I think the traffic was going by at about 60 miles an hour.
I know all about that, trying to empty out freeways by making photographs when you're on the freeway. And there really are cars when I'm there. I just try to wait till there are no cars.
So this is actually a good time for a question from a viewer who asks, both of you have covered freeways. I'll direct it at Kathy. since Christopher kind of covered this. Both of you have covered freeways as a topic in your previous work. Do you think these structures are more beneficial or more detrimental to the city of LA? How do you view freeways?
Well, I mean, beneficial in some ways in terms of commuting, but destructive in how they, I mean, I would use the 10 as the perfect example of really, really creating a completely, disenfranchising in a very historic neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Sugar Hill.
And West Adams and all the way along. So I'm more in favor of public transportation. I think it would be great for freeways to become parks. I know that Geary has planned some ideas around that. I also really liked how Michael Maltzin was covering a freeway at one moment. So there are these really other amazing kind of ideas. I also like the idea of rush hour of Pico goes one way, Olympic goes the other. That makes sense. That becomes to be 4 lanes like a freeway. So I think there are other things that we can do in the city besides honoring the car. Because let's face it, you get on the freeway anyway, and sometimes the surface streets are faster, depending on what hour of day it is. So I'm a fan of them in terms of form. But the images that I was making was about the fact that they would be monuments. That one day they wouldn't be used anymore, that the car would be replaced.
Yeah. There is something if we could go back to number 16, there is something about your image that is very non-prescriptive in a way, that you don't see the cars on them. And while their monumental scale is depicted, there's also a hardness to them that is really compelling. Back to, if we could go back to Robert E. Lee, if we could get image number 4 back on. When you gave a talk about this series, Kathy, and you said of the Lee Monument, which is shown in the bottom image here, you said, to me, it is not the same monument. It now stands for something else. Yeah. And so I'd love to get a sense for what do you mean by that? What was your sense of how that monument's meaning had shifted?
Because it became a site of activism versus a site that was supporting a whole huge avenue dedicated to basically fulfilling white supremacy within Richmond, Virginia, Monument Boulevard. So you went from Stonewall Jackson all the way down that boulevard with these very expensive houses around it that looked out on these monuments, was just a landscape that was supporting the continuation of racism and white supremacy in the country. And so when it became an activist site, what I meant by it was they also had a community garden happening. They had medical tents. They were doing, they were giving COVID information. They had a little basketball court. So it became a site that then no longer belonged to the neighborhood. It belonged to everybody in the United States to go and bear witness on this moment. And I was thrilled by watching these sites as I traversed the country and doing this, of how the different monuments were treated. And for me, this was the most radical of treatments of an activist site.
It's like people visually and physically and in so many ways talking back to a monument that has talked down to them for so long.
They were able to spray paint it. They were able to stake a claim on a piece of land that was not meant for that community whatsoever.
Yeah. This is a great sort of shift to talk about the idea of the recontextualization of monuments and taking some of these existing problematic monuments and maybe not removing all of them, but thinking about how they might be adapted. And I wanted to go to image number 22. I was also on a crazy road trip last year, not to make art, but to deliver a car to my mother-in-law in New Jersey. And I swung through Charlottesville shortly after they had removed their statue to Lee. And they removed everything, the statue, the plinth, and then they put a fence around it. I shot, as you can tell by my skilled photography here, it was shot through. You had to move a tarp, and it was all fenced off. It wasn't visible from the street. And literally somebody had to tell me that that was the Lee site for me to know what it was. And as part of that trip, I had been talking to historian John Edwin Mason, who teaches at UVA. And we had this discussion about how this like complete removal from one day to the next without leaving a plinth, without without there being any kind of signage blocking it off from the public, kind of took away this opportunity for the community to be able to process or even revel in the removal. And so, you know, Christopher, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because in Past Due, in the report, talks a lot about that, is this process to decommission monuments, but also recontextualize them. And I know that this is something that you've been working on with the Junipero Serra monument by Olvera Street. So if we could get image number 20 up. So I'd love to get a sense of how is this playing out now, this idea of recontextualization, and is there an opportunity to recontextualize the site, and are there any good models to point to?
So one of the recommendations of the report is that we need a policy for helping us decide these questions: when it's appropriate to remove a statue, a monument, or a memorial. There will be monuments, memorials, and Sarah maybe falls into this category, that are so painful, that are that bring up so much trauma that they really do need to be removed. There will be other memorials and monuments where it makes more sense to reconsider them, to recontextualize them, to add more context, and really allow a community-driven process to really, as is the case in Richmond, to really express a lot of feelings about sites or monuments or figures from history that have really been bottled up and not allowed to have any public or officially sanctioned expression. And that was a really important part of our discussions. And now it's playing out in two very specific ways as we think about what to do at this site first, and then as we think very close by what a new memorial to the victims of the 1871 Chinese massacre ought to look like, and what form that process should take to produce it. We just had the 150th anniversary of that event, and actually in some ways that was the real genesis of this civic memory working group conversations that I had with Mayor Garcetti very soon after starting, where he talked about his interest in really grappling and reckoning with the violence of that day in 1871, where a full 10% of the Chinese population in Los Angeles was killed in a single afternoon. And as we discovered in doing some of this work, a similar percentage of Angelenos actually were part of the mob that produced that violence. Something like 10% of the LA population at the time was part of that mob, roughly speaking. So in the case of Sarah, we have been working with the City Council in particular on Indigenous Peoples Day this year. We issued for the first time a formal apology to the Native American community, and we have announced plans to rename Sarah Park. So we've been able already to unname it. We now call it LA Plaza Park. And then the next step is to work largely with tribal leaders, but also a broader set of community partners to choose a new name for the park. And then we have announced our intention to do the first indigenous cultural easement in the city, which essentially will give priority access to the space to tribal leaders working with the City and County Native American Indian Commission. And that is very much, we hope, a first step toward land return, which is really the ultimate goal, is beginning to think about how we can return land in full. And so we're now just now working on the details of how this easement will work. I spent an amazing couple of hours last week at the Curavungna Springs site, which is a sacred Tongva springs on the site of University High School in West LA, where there is an agreement between LAUSD and a foundation that was created to give priority access to indigenous communities at that site, which is a very important, still producing fresh water as a spring, very important site. There is an agreement with the city of San Fernando and the Tataviam leadership in San Fernando, and this will be the first example in the city of Los Angeles of that kind of agreement. And I agree with you, the idea that right now it's been able to sit empty, where that pedestal and the emptiness of the pedestal speaks to this action, this activism, I think is really important. And I agree with you that giving some time in that state is really valuable. And then in terms of how we're thinking about the 1871 memorial, we're getting ready to release a request for ideas, which is the first step in the design process. We hope to do that in the next couple of months. And that comes out of, after we released the Civic Memory Report in the spring of last year, we brought together a steering committee of what turned out to be more than 70 Chinese American leaders and other stakeholders in Chinatown to help us think through the process that made sense for the community to develop that memorial. And we got some very specific and really very nuanced recommendations about a design selection process. And to answer your question about models, Charlottesville is the site of another one. At their very first meeting of the Civic Memory Group, Mabel Wilson, who is an architectural historian designer on the faculty at Columbia.
Yeah, let's get photo 24 up.
Fantastic. She was on the design team for the new memorial to enslaved laborers on the campus of UVA. And she talked a lot, as much as she talked about the design, she talked even more about the community process and the conversations, some of them, of course, quite difficult. You can imagine how fraught this site is around the corner from Jefferson's Lawn.
Jefferson's Lawn.
And so that has
And
continued
just down
to
the
be,
street from where the Lee, up the street from where the Lee Monument was.
So that was really, has been a model for us in terms of the process that created it as much as its final form.
So speaking of recontextualizations, I wanted to go to image number 28. Because you brought up in our preparations for this panel, Kathy, one of probably the best monument recontextualizations there is.
Candy.
And you saw this when you
I
were in
did, and
Richmond.
it was one of the treks on the trip I made, and the interesting thing that I found that I had told you over the phone, Carolina, was that when all the arts writers and everybody wrote about this monument,
Which is, just to be clear, this is Kehinde Wiley's
Yeah.
monument in Richmond.
yeah, rumors of war. And one of the things that you don't realize is the placement of the monument. It was never spoken about. But all of a sudden I realized that rumors of war and this figure on this horse, it's a really amazing monument, is literally riding into the next door neighbor of the headquarters of the Daughters of the Confederacy, who had to do with putting up an enormous amount of the monuments all throughout the South. So that was left out, and that was another way of, like what I was talking about, going to Portland and visiting these sites, is also you get a different contextualization than just seeing an image of the work. And I tried to photograph it where I could get the Daughters of the Confederacy in the background from it, but it didn't work. The photograph
We
didn't really
have
work.
an image, number 27. I tried to photograph it too, and I was there at the wrong time of day. And this doesn't show its complete context.
No, so this is the museum behind it.
Yes.
But
the
what-
Daughters of the Confederacy is right to the right.
Yeah, exactly. And it is a very, very specific building in its own right. It's very fascist as far as the architecture goes of that building. And at the time I was there, it had been protesters were trying to get in to burn it down.
Wow.
And so there were bent doors. There was police tape around it, but then there in front of it still stood the two cannons, that flanked it from the Civil War. Wow. And you're just like looking at the police crossing tape and these cannons, and it was really messed with your head.
I saw it many months after the protest, so it was under different circumstances. But like you, I was really surprised by the proximity of his sculpture to that. There was one recontextualization I've been really into recently, and I wanted to share it. Image number 26. This is by artist Joydi Minaya. I think she's based in Florida. I don't remember off the top of my head. But what she does is she does these temporary installations on existing colonial monuments with these bright textile wraps that draw on the history of colonial textile histories, indigenous ethnobotany, the exoticization that goes into into a lot of that imagery, creates these textiles and uses them to wrap these monuments. And I find them these really striking and ebullient ways of taking this colonial history and just completely covering that mess up.
Yeah.
And I love the idea just that a monument can evolve, and that, I mean, that to me also seems like an idea that could find really fertile ground in Los Angeles, where, you know, we're so, we have been so closely identified with the idea of constant flux and change, and this idea that, you know, there's a great Esther McCoy line about Schindler's architecture, that a Schindler house is, you know, in movement, it's becoming, that idea that that also is true of the kind of civic identity, and if it could be true of the monuments as well. I mean, I'm fascinated I'm really curious to see what kinds of responses we get to this call for the 1871 memorial, because the idea that it could be a memorial that changes over time, that the community is allowed to sort of put its stamp on over time, that could have more than one site. All of these things, I think, are part of this evolving conversation of what a monument looks like, as opposed to that classic idea that, you know, so many of these monuments that are coming down, the white man on horseback.
Yeah.
I think the Roosevelt statue from in front of the Museum of Natural History just was taken out yesterday.
Oh,
right,
really?
this week.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So we've all seen, of course, hundreds of examples of that form, and the idea that we could have a sort of mutable or ephemeral or changeable form. And we also talked a lot in the Civic Memory Working Group about temporary, ephemeral, or even mobile monuments. I don't have the number, but if you could bring up the Randy's Donuts.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
That
it
It has
is
a
number
monument in
35.
itself.
35.
Number 35.
So I love this image because it captures two ways of thinking about monumentality that are specific to LA, I think, in some really
Right.
great ways. First of all, the Randy's Donuts, where the sign itself is, the sign is twice as big as the establishment that it's advertising, right? And this sort of monumentality of the signage as opposed to the architecture, very much, of course, meant to be seen from a moving car, really says something important about Los Angeles and how Los Angeles is legible through movement, right? And then also this amazing parade, slow motion parade of the Endeavour space shuttle as it went from LAX to Exposition Park, and something similar with Michael Heiser's rock levitated mass that also came through in this
the
really
city in a very different way.
slow motion way. And I love this idea. We've even talked about a kind of monument to Jonathan Gold that could be movable along Pico Boulevard, you know, which he wrote so beautifully about, that could just take place on a single day. And I love this picture because it sort of encapsulates both of those. So I think a new generation of LA monuments really should pay attention to these particular ways that we have understood the city, and one of them very much is motion, and the way that the city becomes legible through that sort of movement, as opposed to, again, seeing a fixed statue of a man on a horseback that never moves.
It never moves. This is a great switch to what I wanted to talk about, which is how we can think about those monuments differently. And so I'll switch to Kathy now. You know, we're sitting here not far from the federal courthouse.
Yes.
Where you have, I mean, speaking of monumental, a monumental work over several stories.
Every floor of the courthouse.
Every floor of the courthouse has an image that comes together to form Yosemite Falls, correct?
Yes.
And so I'd love to, first of all, like, that strikes me as a monument-like work.
Well, it is, and it does different things, right? Because, I mean, you have to put in a proposal for these projects. It's a public building, and it's a proposal, and, you know, you try to think of what is also something that's iconic. And I'm always interested in debunking the iconic in my work. It's like, you know, okay, you know, we all know about freeways, but how about looking at freeways this way that are kind of empty and change? And so what happens with the federal building in terms of how that is laid out is that it's an utter nature scene, and people like big nature photographs. And do we have it up do we have a slide of it by any
I
chance?
don't think,
No, we
let me
didn't get
double
one?
check. Go
Okay.
ahead and, I don't think we do. Oh,
But you start out with the sky, and then you have the top of the falls, then you have the middle of the falls, and then all of a sudden in the middle of the piece, it starts reflecting back on itself where there's a dark wood and forest. And that for me is really representing the scale of justice too. So trying to make something that is not only iconic in thinking of California, but how can you use a site such as Yosemite Falls as also a fractured notion of nature and a fractured position within the way we look at things or consider things, and also just the extent of what a nature photograph is. And then the falls and the last two floors flip on one another where they're upside down, and it's just pure reflection. So I'm asking that center moment where it's like these darkened woods and this like pebbly river that you're looking down on, to be that moment where you could be losing a family for the rest of your life in relationship to justice or the fraughtness of justice. Mm-hmm. And so the piece was also supposed to be, like a lot of my work, a moment of just like contemplation. But how I worked with it architecturally is very much about the building in itself and what that building does.
How do you, what was interesting to me about it too, you know, touching on what Christopher said, it's like getting us to think differently about what a monument is. You know, there was this knee-jerk reaction in the wake of so many of the topplings to say, well, what statue are we going to put on this plinth now? And the question you ask in past due, and I think what installations at the federal courthouse raise, it's like, well, does it have to be a statue? Can it be something else? And so, were there any gestures you saw in your travels that made you rethink what a monument could be?
I don't know if I'm for monuments, but I'm for some of them, so I have a very conflicting feeling about it.
Well, let's go to photo number 5. I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to pull up one of your diptychs just so we're not looking at donuts
Okay,
while we're
well,
talking
this
about
is
this.
the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama.
Yes.
And this is a monument that is a very important monument. And each one of these steel pieces have engraved in them the names of who was lynched in that county. Mm-hmm. And you walk in and you start out with it on the floor, and then as you slowly move down, these begin to hang over your head. And this is a monument that is for mourning in my mind. Mm-hmm. I could not go through this without sobbing. When Julie and I got to her home county in Louisiana, it was a moment that we both like really felt the gravity of it and the gravity of the actual piece in itself. It's fairly brilliant. But then to put it on top of a remaining Confederate monument in New Orleans that literally has spray painted on it, commissioned by Klansmen, again begin that dialogue.
Yeah. And you saw a lot of the speaking of the Lee Monument covered in saturated in graffiti, there was the...
Well, there were shrouded monuments, too. People did shroud them, but they were just with black cloth.
And there was the informal monuments like the Brianna Taylor. I think of these sites, especially in Catholic countries, the roadside shrine.
But I think I'm interested in memorial more than monument. I think I'm interested in for us to remember a history that is a fraught history and to have a physical relationship to it. I am interested in that more than the celebration of war. I'm pretty over war, and I'm pretty upset about this country in relationship to this notion of democracy and being a great democracy and just the absolute fraught kind of unbelievable place of thinking of $17 trillion being spent on Afghanistan when we're having these conversations and Christopher's doing hard work on a civic level of what a city can be and what this country can be. So I think that's part of making this work is we do have to have these extensive dialogues at this point.
About what's important. It's really interesting just going to the Monument Lab report. That was something in their report, they did an analysis, and overwhelmingly our monument landscape is littered with monuments to war.
I'm really glad that Kathy brought that up because this has been a really tough week for those ideas based, looking at what's happening in Washington. And I think it is important to remember not only that monuments probably as an idea or ideal should be retired, but also that no matter how beautifully designed a memorial is or how much it's the product of a bottom-up, really open, community-based process. It's not a replacement or a stand-in for, the basics of civic participation and democracy and the ability to vote and the ability to have a roof over your head. And I think it is connected to these fundamental questions. So we do our best in the work that we're doing, but we also have to keep in mind these larger issues, and it has been a tough week for some of those larger national ideals that we like to hold up.
Yeah.
In the report, you talk about, you touched a little bit on some of how we could be thinking about monuments in an alternative way. I was really intrigued by what the report says and what you've said in conversation about thinking of the role of gardens and these other spaces that, you know, getting away from this idea of built environment and perhaps a place that is more nurturing. And I'd love, like, what gardens have you visited? What models are there that you have found intriguing? And how does that make sense for Los Angeles in particular?
There were three themes that the conversations in the Civic Memory group kept coming back to, and I will say we were so lucky to have historians and artists and architects and indigenous leaders and a lot of my city colleagues. It was just fantastic to be in a room with people who had been thinking about Los Angeles at the depth that these folks have been thinking about it and working on it.
And by the way, funded by the...
So the book itself was a collaboration with the Huntington USC Institute on California in the West. It was a terrific partner, and the funding to them came from the Getty Foundation. So two really fantastic local partners who absolutely deserve a shout out. So the freeway kept coming up as a touchstone that we had to grapple with. The LA River as an example of this sort of engineered landscape that we're always trying to sort of redeem or reclaim to one degree or another. And then the third was the garden, this idea of a landscape that is changeable by definition, that requires many hands by definition. It doesn't have a single author, that has bound up in it, in its very definition, this idea of long-term maintenance, care, stewardship. All of these issues, as you know, have become such important parts of architectural scholarship in the last few years, this idea of maintenance and care and repair. And the garden sort of embodies all of those things. It's the exact opposite of the idea of a single, famous artist or sculpture producing, the statue of the man on horseback in the middle of the Civic Plaza. So we think, and we had a lot of great conversations about the potential for gardens to help us explore those. And so we did do a temporary COVID memorial up at the Griffith Observatory, which was very moving. I just volunteered for a couple of hours, and even just we planted a flag for each of the victims across the county. And we're now beginning a community process with the Department of Cultural Affairs at the city to think about what a permanent COVID memorial might look like. And it's very much informed by these conversations about the potential of a garden, and I hope that will also inform the responses to the 1871 memorial brief that we're getting ready to put out. So it really just seemed to, in one sort of idea, the memorial, the garden, the landscape, it challenged and I think productively undermined all of these sort of tropes or, what we think of as fixed ideas about what a monument or memorial has looked like.
Can I ask a question of you?
Yeah.
Can you define a garden?
No, and I think it's better open-ended, right?
Okay.
Don't you think?
Well, that's the interesting thing is often we think about a garden, right? Or I think about going to Exposition Park, and, I lived in West Adams for so many years, and I would ride my bike always and go to the Rose Garden, but the Rose Garden I would also often get shooed out of, or they would be like, no, you can't come in here now, or there were all these rules about how you spent time with nature and access. Yeah. And then with my wife starting the community garden in West Adams on Raymond Avenue, where Erica Glazer was able to procure that land and doing that. So I think that the garden is such an interesting way to also explore kind of notion of civic duty within Los Angeles, of what is the purpose of these spaces.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also this idea of maintenance and building in when you're raising money for this memorial. And we're thinking of this in terms of the 1871 project, that you have to be thinking about that ongoing fund for maintenance, whether it's a garden or something else, that if it's going to be changeable or if it's going to have a landscape element or be based in these sort of emerging ideals, it has to include funding and a commitment, because it also gets very fraught and complicated, as you're saying, in terms of access, in terms of maintenance over many years. That's why cities like the statue of the guy on the horseback, right?
Right,
you
because
put it up
it's
and
like,
forget about it.
Unless it's graffiti.
No one's
Highly
gonna,
durable.
No one's going to trip
coating
over
on that
it.
now.
And somebody said something very smart when I started my job, because I was new to city government. They said, you have to understand that 99% of the people you're working with are going to be concerned with two things. They're going to be concerned with liability, and they're going to be concerned with maintenance. And that was one of the wisest pieces of advice that I got from everybody. And that's why so many of these monument statues look the way they do.
Yeah.
And so as you open up the question, you open up the things that you have to pay attention to, that you have to be committed to in terms of how the thing is paid for, how it's conceived, et cetera, and who has access to it, as you said.
Well, that was always the interesting thing about the activist sites as I traveled from one, and even with the Brianna Taylor Memorial, it had also a community garden component where they had taken over growing vegetables where all the flowers once were. And that was just, there was moments like that where, again, you just understand the reorganizing of the structure as well.
So I just wanted to go to a couple of comments to folks who are watching online. George T. on YouTube says, I love how these statues are getting recontextualized after so many years of colonial history. And Mary Lee, also on YouTube, she says, thank you, lots to think about and process. So thanks for tuning in. We do have a new question that also just landed. And I'll lay this out to both of you. How do you think digital technologies might change our understanding of monuments and memorials? You know, speaking of these like temporary things, AR, VR, serving as a layer. I visited a AR memorial related to Armenia in Glendale once that I could see on my phone. So I don't know if that's something that either of you have.
We're definitely thinking, it has come up a lot in the conversations with the steering committee in Chinatown, thinking about that memorial. And it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because nothing goes, can be outdated more quickly than the latest technology, right?
If you don't have that upgrade.
In terms of maintenance, the worst thing in the world would be a very beautifully sort of considered monument with a digital element where the screen is glitching or giving you an error message, right? Yeah. And we've all experienced that. In terms of incorporating digital technology into these features. So the recommendation we got from that steering committee from the community was that the memorial for 1871 should include one primary site that could be suitable for gathering commemoration, that would be a fixed physical location, but that it might be supplemented by a number of secondary sites because the violence actually played out over the entirety of 1871 Los Angeles. Not just moments of violence, but there are also moments of sanctuary where some prominent landowners in Los Angeles gave sanctuary, opened up their property, in one case a vineyard that was owned by a judge that was open to Chinese residents of LA who were fleeing that violence. So we think it would be appropriate, therefore, to have a memorial that could touch on some of those other sites. And it's very easy to imagine that maybe the best way or most effective way to connect them would be some kind of walking tour that could be linked through audio or some kind of digital technology. You know, I think it's been really interesting to see the way that the QR code has been sort of resuscitated for all. I mean, I agree with you. I was reading, I think, your tweets about wall text and QR codes, and I totally agree. But there are some ways in which audio tours can be easily accessible that way, as long as you're thinking about folks who don't have a smartphone, don't have access, and the memorial's legible to everyone. But there are ways in which it can be supplemented, I think, through technology, as long as you're careful. And again, you include a budget for maintenance and keeping up the technology, which breaks down more quickly than the bricks and mortar part, right?
Exactly.
I mean, I'm a little bit more in my answer was going to be kind of on the lines of Christopher, is that I'm actually really interested in using technology to tell history. And that most people at this point do have a smartphone, or if they don't, there's other kind of ways of doing it. But I was my son really into Pokemon, as most kids are. I mean, he's an adult now, but he still likes Pokemon Go. And I was always watching him like traverse the city trying to find these Pokemon, and I was just like,
I have colleagues who are heavy into Pokemon.
Yeah, and I was just like, well, why can't you traverse the city and find something else? Why can't you traverse the city and actually truly find these other meanings? Like, what does it mean when you go through West Adams and to all of a sudden be at a certain site and understand like what took place there? And so I'm really interested in using those kinds of technologies as we carry them around in our pockets to further tell the story of where we live.
I think we are at time. I'm just going to throw out one quick last question that we had gotten for a viewer, so you can give me the Twitter length answer version if that's possible. And this person asks, what interesting ideas, people, or historical events would you like to see memorialized in Los Angeles? Go. No.
Wow.
I have a quick one, which is
Okay.
some memorial or new treatment of history of Chavez Ravine in and around Dodger Stadium to tell the really complicated story of the way that space came to be. And there have been a lot of fascinating proposals, by the way, from artists that could be the foundation of that new exploration.
Ooh, I love that.
I don't know. I think I would like to know more about the history of resistance in relationship to LA. That I feel like that history is piecemealed to a certain extent, where you have to use an enormous amount of resources and kind of library sources to be able to. I don't think that anybody has really written about Los Angeles in that way. I mean, I could point to Mike Davis to a certain extent in terms of City of Quartz and Ecology of Fear.
Yeah.
But I also don't think that there's necessarily a feminist perspective from that either. And so I would like to know more about that, and then what does that have to do with site or place in relationship to the city?
I'll add my 2 cents on top. When I did a big monuments piece in 2020, and there were 2 LA artists, Sandra de la Loza and Arturo Ernesto Romo, who talked about doing a garden. It was like a park garden with a sort of monument, a sculptural element, but really the monument itself was the park, to Sleepy Lagoon, to acknowledge Sleepy Lagoon, the Sleepy Lagoon murders. And you know, as a writer, I don't think the city honors its artists enough. We are not a culture that honors artists enough. And so,
It's Hollywood.
since you're here, Christopher.
It's Hollywood.
I love that idea. No, we don't even have a basic system of plaques, or that most cities will say this is where a house where a famous writer lived, or artist, and
Exactly.
we have even that basic infrastructure we have not yet produced.
Well, whose
so I love
house-
that
Like,
idea.
where did
Whose house
Nathaniel...
just got torn down in Cheviot Hills? Wasn't it J.G. Ballard's house just got?
No, that was
No.
the other sci-fi writer by Tom Main, by an architect, actually.
No.
And his name is escaping
Ray
me.
Bradbury.
Ray Brad. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
yeah, I want to know where Nathaniel West drank his bourbon, like...
I know.
So anyway,
well, thank you, everybody.
On that note,
Perfect place to end.
The
Perfect place
audience is
to
going
end.
wild right now.
thank you so much. I know there's so much applause here. I can't stand it.
Thank
you so much for
to the
coming and having us in your kitchen.
Thanks to both of you.
And thank you to
Great.
Kathy and
Really great.
Christopher, and to the team at the Broad.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.